Hi, I'm Patti. I'm a jewelry designer here at Fire Mountain Gems and Beads, and today I'm going to be showing you how to add texture to metal with hammers. So let's look at the different hammers that we're going to use today. The first one is the most common one that I use in finishing metal, and this is a chasing hammer. It has a special domed surface, which is my favorite kind of chasing hammer to use. It's just very slightly curved on the top. And then it has a ball peen surface on the other side. And then the next few hammers we're going to be using are specialty hammers. So specialty hammers have special surfaces kind of ingrained on them. You can see this one has kind of a diamond pattern. You have kind of a star pattern here. And then here we have one with a dappled circle pattern and one with a stripes pattern. And then really cool, something I wanted to show you is our interchangeable surface hammer. It has all kinds of different surfaces that you can use. It's got a domed surface, it's small, but it is domed. A couple different striped surfaces, some small striking surfaces, and then a couple of weaved pattern surfaces. And the way that you use this, just want to show you real quickly, there are these little bezels on here, and you just unscrew the bezel and choose the surface that you want. We're actually going to use this one, so I'll put that back on. And you just screw the bezel firmly back onto the hammer. So we're going to be using those two surfaces today. Let's take a look at some of the other equipment that we're going to be using. We have some special equipment here for annealing and pickling. If you guys haven't annealed or pickled before, annealing is when you take a piece of metal, or it can be wire, any kind of metal, sheet metal like this, and you heat it till it glows, and that softens the metal so you can more easily apply a finish to it. And then once you've done that, it gets kind of a coating on it, often like a black coating. We call that slag. We put it in what we call a pickle pot. It's a dry acid compound mixed with water, and that removes that so we can continue working on the piece. We've got a little micro torch. Always safety glasses when you're working with pickle or a torch. We've got a firing block. And we've got some large tweezers to hold the metal when it's hot. And then we've got our striking surface, a steel block, a quench dish. We've got some little sanding pads. After you take the metal out of the pickle, that'll have a little film on it. We'll take it off with those. And we've got a pickle pot over here to the side. I'll show you that in a minute when we get to that. A little shop rag here to dry things off with. And a few pairs of pliers. We're going to be working with some wire, and we'll use those to cut the wire and straighten it out a little bit if we need to. Let's go ahead and start working. So the first thing I'm going to do is pick up my little strip of copper. For this purpose, I'm using a 1x6 strip of 24 gauge copper sheet. It was a great way to show you how to do some texturing. Copper is great because it's really soft and kind of like sterling. They're both really soft metals, really easy to apply texture to. But even though it's pretty soft, we want to anneal it first. So we want to add some softness and malleability into the metal. So it's easier for you to apply the texture. You don't have to use so much force. When you're working metal with a hammer or anything, really, when you're working metal, eventually it gets work hardened. And it will not accept the texture the same way as it does when it's nice and soft. So the first thing I'm going to do is fire one of these strips of copper. The other two have already been fired and sanded, so we're just going to do this top one so you can see how that's done. So before I fire, I'm going to remove anything from around the area that could potentially melt or catch fire. We're good now. We've got this silicone mat here, which is just great. And I'm going to go ahead and put my copper in there. And this copper, you can see 6 inches is too long for this firing block. So I'm going to go ahead and anneal this half first, and then I'll use my pliers to scooch it over, because you always want to be using your torch right on the firing block. You don't want to be using your torch off the block over here. The other important thing is to put on my safety glasses. I'm going to go ahead and do that. You get one set of eyes, so make sure and take care of them. Okay, so I'm going to grab my micro torch. This is powered by butane. We're going to go ahead and turn down the lights a bit so you can see the flame just a little bit better. So the way that the micro torch works is you go ahead and pull down on the tab and push the button. And then there's a little switch on the side. You push that in and that makes it constant. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and fire this half of this copper rectangle. And when I'm firing, I don't really want that blue part of the flame touching the metal. I want it just above the metal. And I'm going to move around kind of consistently. You don't want to stay in one spot too long. And we're heating it until it glows. And it's only going to glow in the area where the flame is, but we have to make sure all of the metal that we're trying to anneal does glow. So, and it's going to change colors here. It's kind of a pretty rainbow effect. Eventually it'll turn a bit black, and that's normal. And just keep going until you see it kind of glow. And I'm going to slow down a little bit. And I'm looking at that spot that the flame is hitting, looking for some really red glowing copper. And it takes a little bit longer when you're heating something this large. Often when you're annealing metal for jewelry, it's a smaller piece than this. And I can see that it's changing here a little bit. It's starting to get pretty hot. Okay, now you can see the brick starting to glow there. That means the metal's going to glow soon. And you can also kind of use the brick as a guide as well. It's kind of hard to see under that black slag that we're creating what the metal looks like. Okay, now I'm starting to see my copper change colors a little bit. It's very subtle and it's much easier to see in person. But there's a little extra glow there when my flame is hitting the metal. So I'm just going to do all the rest of it. So it's about the same. You can go in random patterns or the same pattern, it doesn't matter. You don't want to overheat it. You don't want to go too long because the copper will eventually melt. Okay, so to turn off the torch, I'm just going to hit that button and I'm going to put it back in the little torch stand for safety. We're going to go ahead and turn those lights back up. So I've got to be really careful with the metal at this point. It's very hot. So I don't want to touch it with my skin anywhere. I'm going to use my oversized tweezers, get a good grip on it, and put it in the quench dish. Now half of it is quenched. As soon as it hits the water, it's cool, and it's cool to the touch. But half of it hasn't been in the water, and that heat conducts all the way to the end. So I'm going to grab here and put the other end in the quench dish and make sure it's all quenched. Okay. So you can see that you can touch the metal. It's actually cold to the touch now from the water. And you can see that there's this black slag on it. Okay, so we're going to heat the other side of the metal now, and it's going to look the same when we're done. Okay, so now you've got your really nicely annealed metal that is ready to accept texture. Before we do that though, there's this black layer on there called slag. We're going to put this in what's called a pickle pot and remove that first. So let me move the firing block out of the way. The firing block gets warm on top, so handle it by the sides. There you go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pull in my pickle pot. And it's just a little crock pot that it's plugged in, it's on low, and it's got a mixture of dry acid compound called Sparex and water in there. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the lid. And I'm going to go ahead and use the special copper tongs here that go with a pickle pot. You always use these copper tongs for that. And I'm going to go ahead and set that in the pickle compound just for a couple of minutes. And you can see how you can't fit this whole piece in this crock pot. If you have a full-size crock pot, that'll work. But if you're working with a little one, like most jewelers do, you just do it for a few minutes until one side is complete, and then you rinse it off and then put the other side in. Okay, that should be finished. Let's pull it out and check it. That looks really good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put that in the quench dish just to rinse it off. All right, let's go ahead and rinse the other side. Good. So I have an old shop rag here that I like to use just to dry things off a little bit. You can see that there's this coating that kind of comes off of the copper after it's pickled. Just want to dry it off a little bit. So you can see how flexible this metal is now. It just bends really easy. It's very malleable. Before I start hammering though, I'm going to take, you can use some steel wool or you can take a fine grain sanding pad. I think I'm going to do it actually on top of this so we don't get our surface marred up. And I'm just going to sand off that little coating from the pickle. Okay, just a little bit left. Okay, that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to make sure this is dry. We don't want any water on the steel block because that promotes rust. Okay, so I'm going to use these in kind of two parts. I'm going to do one texture on one end and another texture on another end. So let's start with my favorite, that's the chasing hammer. So we've got this domed surface, it's very slightly domed on one side, and we've got the ball peen surface on the other. The domed surface is really good for flattening or applying a very subtle texture. The ball peen surface is better for applying a heavier texture. So I'm going to use the ball peen end here. So I'm just going to hold half of the metal off of the block. And when I'm holding, I'm usually not over here near the hammer and I don't have my thumb flat. I kind of have it at an angle over here and that keeps me from hammering my thumb. But you do want to have it anchored pretty well. Okay, so I'm going to be texturing kind of the whole half of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of start in the middle, and when you're holding the hammer, the little ball of the hammer can be in your hand, but you want to choke up just a little bit. You don't want to have your hand way down here, and you don't want to have your hand way up here because you have to swing harder. So you want it really kind of in the middle. And I like to have my thumb or my finger there really controlling it. Depending on what I'm doing, if I'm really doing a focus tap where I want a small area, I'll choke up and put my finger here so I have a lot of control over right where that goes. It's almost like pointing to where the hammer's going to go. When I'm doing a larger area, I'll probably use my thumb as more of a guide because it gives me more strength. Okay, so I'm going to start in the middle and I'm just going to start tapping it at kind of a medium pressure. So you can see that we're starting to get these nice little dots. Now it's going to take quite a bit to do this whole area. And let's just keep going. So I'm starting in the middle, and then I'm going to kind of move out to the sides. I'm not going to do all of the middle and then all of the sides. If I did that, the metal would curve up, and I don't want that to happen. So you can see how this hammered texture is really starting to take shape down here. So I am going to go ahead and show you a piece that I've already finished all the way, so you can see what that hammered texture looks like after really working on it for quite some time. So you get this really beautiful hammered texture. And then if the metal is a little bit wonky, if it's not flat anymore, you can take some flat nose pliers like this, or you can take some nylon jaw pliers like this and just work it until it's flat again and in the shape that you want it to be. Now sometimes as you're working the metal, it'll get work hardened again and you want to add more texture. If that happens, go ahead and re-anneal it just like we did in the beginning. Pickle it, sand it off, and keep going. Let's look at this really cool cross hammer. I love this one. So we've got this really cool cross-hatched texture on one side, and we've got the star texture on the other side. I chose to focus on this cross-hatched section on this particular hammer. So let's go ahead and grab our metal, and I'm going to anchor it off the block here. And with the cross-hatch, you want to be consistent, but you're going to overlap. So you want to choose an angle, and so I'm going to use an angle like this. They're going to overlap, but I'm not going to move the angle to which I'm applying the finish. Okay, so I'm just going to begin at the corner. Kind of a medium pressure. You can use a harder pressure, but you're going to need to anneal faster the harder that you hit it. So that's a really good start to this one. It needs a little more overlapping. I'm going to go ahead and show you what that looks like when it's completely finished. So here I have a piece that has a really nice cross-hatched finish. And again, I can take my chain nose pliers or my nylon jaw pliers and just manipulate that until it's more straight. Okay, let's move on to another hammer. Next, I'm going to be using this hammer that's got a couple of different surfaces. It's got this kind of little circles, it makes kind of a dappled texture, and it's got this stripy surface that I really like. So let's go ahead and start with the little circular dappled surface. I'm going to go ahead and take a new piece of metal here. I'm going to go ahead and start applying that particular texture here. And you can see how it's not applying a lot of those little circles at first. It takes a while to do this particular one, so you just have to be patient. Now with this one, you can change the angle because they are circles, it doesn't matter. So I can hold my metal over here now. And you can see how that texture is really starting to develop there. So here's a piece with a more complete finish. You can see that you've got all these really nice overlapping circles. It's great for like a moon surface texture. I did a piece recently with that and it just comes out beautifully. Let's flip the hammer around. Then we've got this stripy surface. Really like that one. So I am going to grab the other end of this piece of metal and let's start making that striped texture. So you have to decide kind of what angle you want it to be at. So I'm going to go kind of at an angle like this. And you want to keep it at this angle, but move it around and overlap, just like the other hammer that we did. So it's really starting to develop that really pretty randomly striped texture. The other thing that you can do with this hammer if you want is to change the directions and make it a larger crosshatch as well. So I'm just going to continue a little bit, making sure and go off the ends, off the edges. And that's really developing. And then I'll go ahead and show you what that looks like when it's completed. So when it's finished, you have this really rich, luxurious texture. And again, you can straighten out the metal, see how it's a little wonky. You can take your pliers and straighten it out on the edges and the centers, wherever you need. So let's go ahead to that last hammer. That's that cool interchangeable hammer. So on one side, we've got little diamonds in a crosshatch, and the other side, we've got squares in a crosshatch. So I'm going to go ahead and start with one side. Well, I think we'll do the square side first. I'm going to grab my metal here, anchor it just like we've been doing, choose a direction, and I'm going to keep that same direction. I think I'll go this way on this one. So you can see how you're starting to get that dappled texture like we did with the chasing hammer with the ball peen end, except for they're more edgy. And when this one is finished, I've got it marked here, it looks like this. So it's like kind of a heavier hammered look with those squares. It's more edgy. So when we flip it around and we use the diamond surfaces, it's a similar thing. It's a pretty similar texture. It's subtly different though. So I'm going to go ahead and choose an angle to go at. And then when that one is finished, you have just a slightly different look. You can see this side is the squares, this side is the diamonds. It's very similar, but just depends on exactly the finished look that you want. All right, well, that wraps up the sheet metal portion. The last thing that I want to show you is how to create some texture on wire. For that one, I'm just going to use the chasing hammer. Wire is too narrow for you to see most of those specialty hammer finishes, but you can make great finish on wire with a chasing hammer. So I just want to show you a little bit of that. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off a little bit of this sterling silver wire. It's about 18 gauge, just a section of it. So you see we've got that here. I'm going to straighten it out just a little bit with my nylon jaw pliers so it's flat. There we go. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is flatten the wire so we can apply a texture. So I'm taking the domed surface of my chasing hammer and I'm just going to flatten all the way down evenly. Flip that around. Now you can see the domed surface has given it a very slight texture. I'm going to flatten it just a little bit more so we have a little more room to work for texture. And then I'm going to flip my hammer around and use the ball peen surface, and I'm going to go over the edges back and forth. So I'm going right off the edge to the center to off the edge. And you can see when you do that, you end up with this really brilliant shine that reflects off of all of those hammered surfaces. And then I'm going to show you the same on a little bit wider copper wire, just a little piece of that so you could see. Again, I'll straighten that out a little bit with my nylon jaw pliers. Okay, and again, I'm going to flatten it with the dome surface. Straighten it out a little bit with my fingers. can use your chain nose pliers or your nylon jaw pliers to do that as well. And you can see the light texture on there that's a little reflective. But when I flip around and use the ball peen end, you get that brilliant kind of smaller texture. And you can see that the wire will naturally curve as you do that. You can just straighten it back out. And if you need to get a little more flexibility, a little more malleability back in the wire, you can always anneal it and pickle it and start again. So there you can see that really brilliant hammered texture. Well, that wraps up our hammered finishes. I hope you've enjoyed seeing what you can do with hammers and texture and metal. And I hope you get a chance to play with those and kind of add some new dimension and some new excitement to your jewelry. Thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like, share, subscribe. We really appreciate that. And we will see you next time.